The Joe Rogan Experience.
No.
So when you put together JFK, you have this film that is about this incredibly important subject, but yet you want to make it interesting and you want to make it a great film, and you succeeded in doing that. But what is that like, doing that balancing act of having so much information to tell?
Yeah.
Like, that story's so complex.
It was 3 hours and 10, 12 minutes, and I got it through the system, which is unbelievable. I'll tell you how later. But at the time, I needed a protagonist, and a protagonist, and who was the guy?
Yeah.
The only person who ever brought any kind of charges publicly was Jim Garrison.
Yes.
In New Orleans, he was a district attorney, and I read his book. He wrote 2 books, and I actually got to know him. And he was a man who, like 20 years after he did this and went through hell, came back to it and wrote another book, and that's the book I bought. In other words, he was devoted to this subject, like you are. He believed
A lot more than me.
he'd been a patriot in World
Yeah.
War II, and he'd served in Korea. He'd been called every name in the book. But as a patriot, he firmly believed that Mr. Kennedy was killed by these intelligence forces, and he went after it. And in those days, you just couldn't do it. You couldn't prove a covert operation.
Right.
He got killed by the press, and we've found out a lot more about what was going on. We know a lot more facts about how the media went after him with a lot of bullshit accusations, and made him look as bad as possible.
Well, Kevin Costner did an amazing job of playing him in your movie, too. I mean,
Well, he was the basis of that. Once you get a Costner in the middle of it, then you can start to move. You've got an interesting central character. Then you bring in all these crazies that you read about, people like Jack Lemmon, Walter Matthau, all the lunatics around New Orleans, Dallas, involved in the war against Cuba.
Yeah.
And you get Lee, and then I wanted a Lee Harvey Oswald character, which was to tell a little bit of his story. So I had 2 stories, Garrison and Oswald. I got to know Marina. I didn't, tracked a lot of the Oswald story. Not enough of it, but there's more now. But he seems to have been definitely in the employ of the CIA when he went to Russia the first time, and when he came back again. There's too much evidence of it.
Yeah.
And we want to bring that out too. But that story becomes, and then the third story would be the Dealey Plaza, the actual assassination. So Garrison's not there. He has to go back into the past to find this out, right? So he has that thread. That whole Dallas section is part of the structure. It starts the movie, but we go back to it at the right time, and at the climax we go back to it for the final time, the way it probably happened. See? So then that's 3 stories. And then the 4th story, if you want to know the truth, in my thinking at that time, was the Donald Sutherland business.
Yes,
he comes into the movie at the halfway point, and he gives Garrison a lot of new information, because Garrison thinks he was dealing on the local level. He thinks he's dealing with something that's in New Orleans. He's not sure what beyond it. So now Cohen says it's a much bigger story, which sends Costner into the last act, going to Dallas, and it's too much for the Costner character. He's blown away by it. He knows he's up against forces much larger than he ever thought.
And this what was the motivation for the Donald Sutherland character?
Fletcher Prouty. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He was the focal officer between the CIA and the Pentagon. An old-timer, World War II, did a lot of service, and he was in charge of basically providing the CIA with military equipment for covert operations. He worked in Tibet. He worked on a lot of the operations in the 50s and the late 40s. We had operations going on in Ukraine, at China, Tibet. He trained Tibetans in the Colorado mountains, and many stories. He's written several books. He was a keen observer of the differences that were going on. He knew Dulles, used to brief him, and told me stories about then. Everything changed after Kennedy was killed.
So you got to meet him.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I hung out with him. Garrison too. I mean, both of these were authentic men, and Fletcher described, the difference after November '63. He felt it right away. He left the Pentagon a year later. It was over. there was something that changed in the country. And sure enough, we were in Vietnam faster than you can imagine with combat troops.
Yeah, another crazy character in that whole historical record is Jack Ruby.
Oh, yeah.
He's a very strange one, and I just read a book called Chaos by Tom O'Neill. It's about the CIA and Manson in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, I know the book, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But Ruby is in that book as well, because Ruby was actually visited by, I forget his name, Jolly.
Jolly West.
What's his name?
Jolly West.
Jolly West, thank you. Who was the central character in MK Ultra, who they believe was involved in these various, that's a plasticell. No, it comes off my arm. Don't worry about it.
I'm listening.
But he was a central character in the CIA's use of LSD during the whole Operation Midnight Climax in San Francisco, and they ran a free clinic in Haight-Ashbury that's connected to Manson, where they were giving people LSD and running studies on them.
Yeah,
and he
I read
went to
about
visit Ruby in prison, and Ruby, who had shown no psychological trauma or distress after he left, was a mess, curled up in a fetal position on the ground, and was thinking they were burning Jews in the streets, and literally was in a psychotic state. And they think they dosed him up while he was in jail.
Yeah, he seems to be the mob connection to this thing.
Yes. Yeah.
You can put your arm back.
Fix it back. Yeah. It's
No, Ruby's his contacts alone. He goes back many years to the 40s. He was mobbed up completely and didn't want to do it. He was forced into doing it.
Why do you think he was forced? What do you think it was?
I think he was scared.
About what?
Well, I have never followed that in depth because people say that organized crime killed him. I don't believe that because they didn't have the power to pull this thing off. I think that they're an element to it. Yeah, you wanted somebody to rub out Oswald.
Right.
Probably Oswald was intended to die there on that day, you see.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things that point in that direction, but he didn't, and he couldn't be allowed to go.
It's just crazy that they got Jack Ruby to do it.
I mean, they killed off everything that Oswald said in that police station is gone.
Yeah.
It's hearsay. But what he said in the corridor outside, it's very interesting. And we know that Ruby was there. So Ruby, I think, was pushed into this thing because they had to make it. It was a quick operation. We got to get to him,
And it's really crazy. The story plays out 12 years later when, on the Geraldo Rivera show, Dick Gregory brings a Zapruder film and introduces it to the American public.
Yeah.
And then they get the chance to see Kennedy's head going back into the left.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, what?
Yeah. That's a disgusting story. But, on the Ruby affair, don't forget that he was urgently asking the Warren Commission to get me to Washington. I want to talk.
Jesus.
What he knew, he didn't know everything. I don't think anyone knew everything. He knew his part of it. So the whole idea was that how can you get cancer out of the blue like that so suddenly?
Yeah.
So suddenly and die so quickly. Now, there again, there's a lot of cancer experimentation going on at this point in the 60s. You mentioned doctors and the MLK. Cancer, too. There was a huge experiment. There was a doctor in New Orleans, I forgot his name, but working on it. And David Ferry was one of these people who knew him. Ferry had a lot of mice, and he was operating on his mice. He was using his mice as cancer, feeding them huge doses of cancer. The idea was that they said they were going to kill Castro with it. Inject Castro with a needle and kill him because they'd make it so strong. They're getting this cancer they're building up through these mice a cancer that was so powerful that could kill. I mean, I heard everything on this film, but there seems to be truth to this.
Do you feel like you're going to put it to bed with this documentary in your mind? Like you can?
It's the best we can do. I mean,
relax?
I have Jim DiEugenio working with me. He's followed this thing like he's a fifth generation researcher, and he's very, very up to date. But
when is this coming out?
I don't know yet. Well, I don't know if we can get it out. We're going to try.